Okay, white people, here's the deal. I know most of y'all are just trying to get through the rest of the holidays without having to hear any more of your dad's casually racist takes on running quarterbacks or having to stop his drunk brother from spray painting Let's Go Brandon on the gay interracial neighbor's new Prius. But we gotta talk about Bob and Stu for a second because they're becoming quite troublesome. You know those Republicans freed the slaves memes they keep sharing on social media? Yeah, I hate them too for obvious reasons, but this is America, where unfortunately we let sex offenders lie their way into public office just because their legs don't work. While technically these memes are true, they might as well have a postscript saying that there's a 2% chance that ruggedly handsome gentleman you let slide into your DMs and that I usually don't do this on the first date with last weekend was literally Fred Flintstone. Because technically that's also true. I don't know what y'all are being taught down south, but even in the most whitest of Wonder Bread school districts up north, unless you spent 3 years of junior high at Prager U Juniors like I did, we get taught that right around the time FDR came into office, which just so happened to be smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression, the Democratic Party's constituency, ergo its policies, began to shift from the rural everyman to the urban day laborer. Throughout the 1920s, the OGOP was able to ride the shared wealth accumulated during that time, as well as the goodwill from all of those former slaves and children of who still remembered the first watch night service, into basically political domination. But then Black Tuesday happened, and all that free market pro-business policy wasn't really looking too great from a PR standpoint. So what was Herbert Hoover Dam's response to the single greatest economic crisis to that point in history? Bailing out the banks. Obviously, enter Franklin Dimebag Delano, who admittedly used some of Hoover's ideas that he never got to utilize because, again, he bailed out the banks first. Obviously. So by the time Roosevelt 2.0 had stopped wheeling and New Dealing right in time for Armageddon, the Democratic constituency shifted from the rural backroads to the urban centers, where the people most likely to benefit from all those socialist policies, namely northern and midwestern city dwellers, dwelled. Among them, immigrants and blacks who had come up from the South in search of better job prospects and away from the Klan. Obviously. Now, quick disclaimer. Black voters during this time had already become kind of alienated from the GOP at large because the GOP didn't really want to sully its hands with all those pesky civil rights and anti-lynching demands the United Negro Nation was calling for, lest they alienate the more socially moderate portion of the Republican base. So black Republicans during this time weren't so much voting for their own party as they were against the opposition, if based on nothing else but principle. Obviously. But again, money talks, even to us darkies. So despite Roosevelt not really caring about black people until his cousin wife forced him to and not reflecting in his policy, black people who, and this is not a shock at all, disproportionately affected by the Great Depression and Hoover's failure to relieve it, were way better off with the New Deal than without it. So if you ever wanted to know why and how black people basically got stuck with one party every single election cycle, there you have it. But wait, bucko, because there is more. As the times began changing, Martin began marching, and Northern Democrats began to realize that they actually stood to gain more by just not being dickheads to black people. The dickhead faction of the Democratic constituency decided the only way to keep America great again was through domestic terrorism. Obviously. So now we get into the juicy, fatty bits of our story. Mostly, but not at all exclusively, Southern dickhead crats who just couldn't stomach the thought of having to piss in the same toilet as a black became alienated by their party's embrace of basic human decency. This combined with the growing tide of young fiscal conservatives and libertarians who don't get nearly as much attention as their pot-smoking, LSD-dropping, Hendrix-standing Scooby-Doo sidekick counterparts on the left created modern conservatism. What? You mean to tell me Pop Pop and Meemaw didn't conceive my dad in the back of a VW camper during Crosby, Stills, and Nash's debut set at Woodstock? Possibly. What often gets lost in retelling the story of the New Deal, a lot of people, both young and old, didn't actually like the highly regulated welfare state the USA was becoming post-Golden Era Disney. But since history is written by the winners and obviously the welfare state won out, an accurate representation of our past when there's propaganda to be pushed and boomer nostalgia to be shoved down our throats. Obviously. The reason why we got to acknowledge this is because the electoral map didn't suddenly flip on its head the moment the clock struck 1968. No, we got to go back to at least 64 because despite Lyndon, the B stands for Big Johnson, absolutely mud stomping Barry Goldwater, the GOP managed to win 5 deep South states. I mean, they were the only states Goldfinger won in that election aside from his home one, but that's not the point. You got to understand, until 1964, voting Democrat was as southerly as Satan. It would be like if next election cycle, Texas actually flipped instead of CNN just projecting it because, you know, we got to get ratings. And then sitting there slack-jawed and amazed on election night that their projections were once again f***ing stupid. Now, contrary to a lot of unscholarly opinion, the South was not left behind by the New Deal. Exhibit A being the TVA, which meant being a Southerner no longer had to mean fighting off cottonmouths with your kerosene lamp on the way to the outhouse. Because now you have such technological marvels as plumbing and light bulbs. But because the South is the South, local politicians started chafing at the idea of the feds infringing on the autonomy of their localities. In other words, post-New Deal Southerners decided they'd rather take a shit and get bit than to let the feds tell them what to do. And this is why, although economics and political autonomy did play significant roles in the realignment of America's parties, we gotta go back to the race issue. Although we can point directly to Count Dracula's 1968 campaign as the point of no return for the Republican Party, we gotta come back to Goldwater. Believe it or not, Barry GOLDENE was an oddity of both his and our time in that he was an old conservative white dude who didn't publicly hate black people, but secretly sire illegitimate jungle fever love children that we wouldn't learn about until decades later. And that's what I call black girl magic. Goldwater actually supported the 57 Civil Rights Act, but he reluctantly opposed the 64 one because he felt that it infringed upon states' rights. States' rights to do what, you may ask? That being said, some historians argue that Goldberg had other motives, namely to divide and conquer the Dixie faction of the Democratic base, thus sowing the seeds of the infamous Southern strategy that would define GOP politics until pretty much now. And that was pretty much Goldmember's song and dance throughout that whole election cycle. Also nuke the commies, and well, that just turned out peachy, didn't it? Now we fast forward to 1968, which according to every boomer-produced documentary and biopic I've ever seen is evidently the only year in which anything of historical significance happened in America until 2001. So the Democrats were basically doomed from the moment Bobby Kennedy took a slug to the chest. So they trotted out this piece of dried fruit to take on Tricky Dick Tracy and a Klansman in a triple threat cage match for the U.S. Heavyweight Championship. And guess who won? This guy did. By a freaking landslide, by appealing to the silent majority of white Americans who had grown discomfited by the seemingly unstoppable rights revolution of the 60s. A revolution that impacted in large part the former Jim Crow South. Nixon employed what has been referred to by historians as dog whistle politics, playing up how he'd get tough on crime and restore law and order in American society. In other words, put the niggers and hippies back in their place. And this is according to the guy that came up with the strategy. And don't try to tell me it wasn't about race, because Nixon, the supposed political conservative, if anything, expanded big government. I mean, this is the guy who created the EPA after all. Also, he pulled out of Vietnam, so that surely disappointed all of the war hawks and free marketeers, right? Well, not enough that he'd miss out on a second term, because I mean, Jesus H. tap dancing Christ, look at this thing. This, in scholarly terms, is what we call getting absolutely mopped. Also, let's go back to 68 for a second. You see all those gold states in the Deep South, the ones that turned coat the previous election cycle? George C. Wallace won those states. You know why he won those states?
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
This video wasn't really meant to be a crash course on mid-20th century American politics, but I think it's necessary to support the point I'm trying to make, which is literally just the title of the video. So we know that politicians like Goldwater and Nixon and strategists like Kevin Phillips were the generals in this war on progressive politics. But do you want to guess who were the ground troops? If you guessed hourly canvassers and fresh-faced field organizers, then boy howdy are you dead wrong, bucko, because it was the preachers, white preachers, who won the South for white supremacists. I mean, they never really lost it, did they? So, moving on. Here's the thing. The further you go down the ticket, the less influence Nixon exercised on the ballot in those election cycles I mentioned earlier. Here's a common misconception I'd like to debunk today. It's not illegal to vote for two different parties on the same ticket. It's freaking stupid, but split tickets are much more common than you think. For example, New Jersey, a solidly Democratic state in pretty much every presidential election cycle, barely missed out on having its second Republican governor in the past 8 years this year. You see this beached whale? He was our governor for 8 years, and a pretty freaking popular one, at least with his own constituency. So popular, in fact, that way too early in the 2016 election cycle, he was a legit threat to becoming the first U.S. president since Taft unable to fit in a standard-sized bathtub. The mass Dixiecrat defection didn't really materialize at the local level until the 80s. This was in part because the national GOP didn't really have any organizational structure in the South until Reagan, because why would they? Again, this is what it looked like until 1964. And there was all the possibility in the world that it was just a fluke that time. Until it wasn't. So remember that dog whistle politics I talked about earlier? The trick was finding one that would resonate with Southerners on a more personal and intimate level than just getting tough on crime, because let's keep it a buck, the main people pissing their pants over purse snatching are usually the ones least likely to be affected by those things. Interreligious freedom. Y'all see where this is going, right? By framing the fight against the Cultural Revolution as one against government encroachment on spirituality and morality, Southerners were able to assume the moral high ground, because it's not about the niggers. It was never about the niggers. It's about family values and Bible study classes and state rights, college football, apple pie, little Susie, pickup trucks, bald eagles, and a Bass Pro on every corner, or whatever the I talked briefly in the past about the Southern Baptist Convention. You know, the same Southern Baptist Convention that's harboring rapists. Anyway, remember how I said I would never not bring up the fact that the SBC was created specifically and arguably exclusively to defend white supremacy and chattel slavery? Well, little known fact, MLK was invited to speak at a SBC seminary in 1961. In response, SBC churches stopped giving to that seminary, to the point that the school had to apologize for hosting King in the first place. Additionally, SBC academia effectively shunned the professor who invited King into early retirement. Now, as some of y'all may have learned during last year's presidential cycle, just because schools were formally desegregated with the Brown v. Board decision, that didn't mean states didn't try to get around it. This is how and why busing became the GOP's best chance to keep the corpse of Jim Crow alive and kicking. You know this scene from Futurama? Well, white evangelicals basically did that with schooling, but instead of blackjack and hookers, it was Jesus and metric tons of small dick energy. So of course, Jimothy Mr. Peanut Carter, the greatest humanitarian we've ever had for a president, said bollocks to that crap. And in 1978 planned to force the racists to stop being racist and desegregate their schools. But then Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich happened. Just in case you needed more evidence that white evangelicalism is just white supremacy wearing a Jesus piece, Falwell and Weyrich formed the moral majority in 1979, directly in response to Carter's efforts to integrate evangelical private schools. FYI, for as much credit as family values gets for facilitating the rise of the religious right, throughout the 70s, many evangelicals actually supported increasingly liberal abortion laws. Then SBC President W.A. Criswell actually spoke in support of the Roe v. Wade decision when it was made, citing a more traditionalist opinion that a child's life was not its own until it was fully separated from its mother's. So my point is, race, or rather keeping the races separated, was the primary catalyst for the mass Dixiecrat exodus of the 70s and early 80s. So as I alluded to in an earlier video, the GOP's transformation into Mein Kampf Stars and Stripes edition has been a pretty long time coming. Worse yet, it was the people who you'd expect would be fighting tooth and nail to prevent that from happening who facilitated it. So you might be thinking that I made this video just to make fun of evangelicals, which, duh. But more importantly than that is to set the record straight. In a world where truth has become subjective and it's become acceptable to pick and choose which parts of history we want to acknowledge based on how much they do or don't hurt our feelings, it's important for us to know the actual factual truth of how we got to where we are today. So if and when you sit down to your next roast beef feast this holiday season and your ornery old great aunt Gertrude goes on one of her Percocet-fueled rants about the liberal war on Christian values she learned about listening to Megyn Kelly, first, hide her dentures and remove the tennis balls from her walker. Then show her this photo and say, oh, you mean these Christian values? Obviously.